The Great Carrollton Debate. First day. Dr. Ditzler's first reply. Mr. President, with profound gratitude to God for his preserving care and redeeming mercy, we appear before you today to present our defense of what we believe to be the truth of God. It is with pleasure and satisfaction that we have one so experienced in Christian polemics, matured in judgment, ripe in scholarship, skillful in debate, as J.R. Graves, LL.D. From my extensive tours of late years in Tennessee, Alabama, Missouri, and Texas, and in southern Kentucky, I learned that no man on the continent commanded the influence among Baptists that Dr. Graves now commands. It is therefore with propriety that the Baptist papers speak as does the Western Baptist when it says, Dr. Graves has a reputation, honestly and fully deserved, that is worldwide. We doubt not, if it was left to the Baptists of the South and West, in such a discussion as the present one, he would be the first choice. By unanimous consent. His great familiarity with the points at issue, his wonderful powers of analysis, his rhetorical skill, his readiness and brilliant repartee, make him a foe to be dreaded before the masses. In a word, he is everything that could be desired for the work before him. He evidently pities me and says, "We rejoice that Mr. Ditzler has consented to become the scapegoat for the Methodists of Carrollton." In such a discussion as this, it is fully expected that those fundamental principles in philology that lie at the foundation of this question, read by Dr. Graves, and on which all immersionist writers of note agree. The question turns, by them settled, will be fully scientifically and therefore satisfactorily settled. Hence, so much do scholars realize this, that Dr. Conant has only 16 1-2 lines of English quotations from the Bible, 16 1-2 lines from James's version in his whole book on baptism, if I was correct in my careful count, and a Campbell, 10 1-2. These are fair examples. The rules of exegesis, read to you by the doctor, we cordially accept in their connection and intent, so far as Ernesti, Stewart, and Blackstone were cited. Section 1. Mode or action of baptism. The first thing in order now is a definition of the term so often to be used, and often accommodatingly, during this discussion. Dip. To dip, in the sense we aim to discuss here, is to put an object in or into an element water and immediately withdraw it. To such an act, we apply the word dip. See Webster. It was the word always used by the Baptists till comparatively recent times. It is very different from immerse. Immerse. Immerse is an anglicized Latin word, eminently classic, compounded of in, spelled iam for euphony, and mergo to sink. Hence, the English of immerse is to sink in. Whenever you put an object into or under a liquid, it is immersed while it remains in the element. The moment it is withdrawn, it is not immersed. In fully 3/4 of the terms in regular use, where dip is used, it is a partial, not complete, though momentary entrance into the liquid. I am said to dip my finger into a drop of liquid, my pen in ink, a piece of bread in sop. There is no envelopment in such cases, and only momentary contact. Section 2. Authorities. The authorities usually appealed to are 1. The expressions used in James's version, which is a reprint of Tyndale's 1626, so far as the New Testament expressions and use of baptize go. As Dr. Graves proves, Introduction to M. Stewart on Baptism, page 24, that immersion was the practice in England, long after this, even till the 17th century, when aspersion gradually came in. And A. Campbell, Christian Baptism 140, proves that James's translators would not on any occasion favor the innovation of sprinkling by any rendering or note marginal in that translation. We are perfectly willing to appeal the case to the highest courts of judicature known in the Republic of Letters. By consent and practice of all parties, our leading sources of information here are 1. The lexicons, 2. The original languages, in which now comparative philology must be introduced, 3. The ancient versions, made by the most competent authorities, and so sustained and preserved through all time since. The first and most popular appeal is to the Greek lexicons that define the verb baptizo, i.e., baptize. Over all the land for years past, the language I find in last week's paper, The Baptist, and verbatim the same in the tract sent out by the Central Baptist Company, St. Louis, Missouri, page 17, has been in substance reflected until it is a song. 32 Greek lexicons define baptizo to dip, plunge, or immerse, and not one of them defines it to pour or to sprinkle. We charge not those good men with willful wrong here. We believe they never saw the great body of the works elsewhere, by them quoted or named. But we look for a better course hereafter. Are our immersion friends willing to be governed by the lexicons? Will they abide their authority? Some lexicons are written solely to explain classic Greek, where baptizo applies to overwhelming with debts, taxes, burdens, to intoxicate, overwhelming and sinking ships, drowning, overflowing, inundating, etc., i.e., to abusing, aspersing, pouring abuse upon people, but never in the New Testament is it so used. In classics, it is never used in any religious or ceremonial sense. They at times, though rarely, tell us such and such word is used in the New Testament in such and such sense, also marking the distinction of its use and meaning in classic and New Testament Greek. On the contrary, many lexicons are published solely to define New Testament Greek. These vary in different schools. One, as Wall, will explain the New Testament words at times from New Testament standpoints, at others wholly from the classic standpoint, while Stoichius mixes badly and perplexes often, and is seemingly contradictory of himself. Others, the great body of them, give the classic meanings, then the New Testament meaning elaborately. We shall quote the great body of the best lexicons of all schools and all ages known. To save time, then, we freely grant you that when giving the classic meanings, all lexicons give either immerse, sink its English, dip, plunge, overwhelm, often all, as among the classic meanings, and a very few. As Brettschneider, Wall, etc., give one or more of these as among the New Testament meanings. We make this statement to do justice to all sides. Besides, our opponent will fully present that side. The only question with our opponent being, do they give sprinkle or pour? That is the point at issue now. I will give 4 authorities, first who did not write lexicons, or a clavis, critica sacra, etc., but who spoke from the standpoint of lexicography, defining and rendering the word. We quote them, because they are earlier than any lexicon we have defining baptizo, Hesychius, and Suidas, i.e., natives, of the 4th and 10th centuries, only defining partially the root bapto. 1. Tertullian, AD 190, defines baptize to sprinkle, perfundere, de anima, c. 51. 2. Julianus, 4th century, a most learned critic, defines it sprinkle, perfunder, baises or no, Matthew 3. 3. Augustine, the illustrious theologian of that age, sanctions this as to its religious import. See baises or not, Matthew 3, 611 folio. 4. Euthymius, a learned Greek father, 4th century, renders baptizo to sprinkle, rantizo, Alford, on Mark 7:4. 5. Schwartzius, to sprinkle, to besprinkle, to pour upon. Ingham Baptist Handbook on Baptism, page 40, and in Booth's Pedo Baptist in Baptist Library, pages 351 to 352. 6. Grimshaw, copied besprinkle. 7. Ed Robinson, the more general idea of ablution or effusion. 8. Kuma, native Greek, besprinkle, shed forth. 9. Wall, edition of 1831, to sprinkle, perfundo. 10. Parkhurst 111, effusion, copying Stoichius. 11. Liddell and Scott, first edition, steep, wet, pour upon. 12. Suissa, by immersion or sprinkling, per immersionum aut aspersinum. 13. Schneider, vibratio, as that word in meaning, shed forth, sprinkle, wet. 14. Sophocles, ablution, bathed, baptized in tears. 15. Edley, to sprinkle. Adsperger, 16. Wolfius, sprinkle, aspersion. 17. Walaeus, indifferently, sprinkling or immersion, aspersion and immersion, Lees Kritsak. 18. Vossius 3. Adsperger, to sprinkle. 19. Ast perfusion, perfusionum. 20. Shate genius, to pour forth, profundo. Ewing, pour abundantly upon, i.e. infuse. Ingham, page 39. Elder Wilkes, Louisville Debate 511th, reports him overwhelmed by pouring upon, drench or impregnate with liquor by effusion. 22. Gazes, learned native Greek. Shed forth anything, water, pour upon, epichuno, epi, upon, and cheo, pour. 23. Stoicheus. As the three following lexicons are so important and so generally garbled, we will read their definitions in full, the more as Stoicheus and Schleusner are of the class that believed that wash, sprinkle, etc. were meanings derived from the idea of dipping or immersing. Stoicheus, baptizo, lavo, baptizo, passivum baptizomai, luor, lavor, I wash, wet, besprinkle, I baptize, passive voice, I am washed. He then gives its classic or general meaning, as he understood it, in the usual note B appends to most words, where he analyzes it from the unscientific and false standpoint of that day, refuted by both sides now. Quote, generally, and by the force of the word, it obtains the sense of dipping or immersing. Specially, A, properly, it is to immerse or dip in water. B, tropically, 1, by a metalepsis, it is to wash lavar, or cleanse abluer. Because anything is accustomed to be dipped or immersed in water, that it may be washed or cleansed, ut lavetur, vel abluatur. Quamquam et adspergendo aquam, lotio vel ablutio fieri quit et solate, Mark 7:4, Luke 11:38. Hinc transfertur ad baptismi sacramentum, etc. per met, designat, ai, miranulosum spiritus es sancti, effusionum super apostolos, alios credentes, turn oberdonorum spiritus es copium. Prout olim aqua baptizandis copiosa fundabatur, vel illa penitus in aquam immergibantur, etc. Note well this author, that it may be washed or cleansed, although also the washing or cleansing can be, and generally is, accomplished by sprinkling the water, Mark 7:4, Luke 11:38. Hence, it is transferred to the sacrament of baptism. End quote. Here Stoicheus, always heralded as the prince of immersion lexicons, tells us that the washing of baptizo was generally soleat fieri, accomplished adspergendo, by sprinkling the water, and cites the Gospels of Mark and Luke as his proofs. In view of that fact, the term is applied to the sacrament of baptism, and quotes a number of texts on that point. But he does not stop there. Quote, 3. Metaphorically, it designates A, the miraculous pouring out effusionum of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles and other believers, as well on account of the abundance of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, since anciently the water was copiously poured upon those baptized, or they were immersed deep in the water, etc. End quote. Here Stoicheus declares that because the water was copiously poured on those baptized, hence the New Testament writers apply baptizo to the miraculous pouring out of the Spirit. 24. Schleusner has been claimed as a great witness for exclusive immersion. I hold him as well as Stoicheus in my hand. He is a great standard. Quote, properly, I immerse or dip, I plunge into water, from bapto, and answers to i.e., translates, tabhal, 2 Kings verse 14 in the Alexandrian version, and taba in the version of Symmachus, Psalm 68:5, and in an uncertain one i.e. who translated it, Psalm 9:6. But in this sense it never occurs in the New Testament, but very frequently it does in Greek writers, i.e. classics, for example, Diodorus Siculus 1:36 of the overflowing of the Nile, Danilo exundante, etc., Strabo, Polybius, etc. End quote. Like Stoicheus, he now derives wash, cleanse, from the idea of dipping in water that an object may be washed. Hence, too, abluo, lavo, aquapurgo, I cleanse, I wash, I purify with water. thus it occurs in the New Testament, etc. He cites cases, renders it wash, lavar, each time, or baptizo, not only to wash, but even to wash oneself can be proved by many passages. Hence, it is transferred to the solemn rite of baptism. He shows where, in this connection, the Greek baptizo interchanged in many codices MSS with rantizo, sprinkle. He continues, 4. Metaphorically as the Latin imbuo, to imbue, to give and administer, to copiously, pour forth profundo, abundantly. Such is the testimony of this learned lexicographer. His sense is, baptizo is not used modally in the New Testament at all. It is used for an ordinance, a rite. It may be performed in any mode possible: dip, sprinkle, pour. In the mere sense of dip, etc., it never occurs there. In the classic sense it never occurs, as in Diodorus Siculus I, Strabo. Polybius, in the mere sense of tabhal and tabha in Hebrew. Note, he gives pour as one of its New Testament uses. 25. Passo. We reserve this to the last because it is admitted by all scholars, German, English, American, by immersionists and effusionists, to be the most learned, most scientific and critical of all Greek lexicons ever issued. 1841, being in 3 large volumes, the one I hold having 1,884 pages in it, double column, fine print. Hence, the falsity of Liddell and Scott, whose lexicon, far smaller than this one volume, though coarser print also, is claimed to be an enlargement of this. It is in German. Baptizo from bapto, one, oft and repeatedly, to immerse, to submerge, with ice and prose, etc. Thence to moisten, to wet, sprinkle, benetzen, anfeuchten, begießen, über, übergießen, überschütten, überhaufen, etc., generally to besprinkle, to pour upon, to overwhelm, to burden with taxes, debts, etc. 3. To baptize, suffer one's self to be baptized, also to bathe, to wash. Such is Passo's and Host's testimony. Where now this cry of no lexicon defining baptizo to sprinkle nor to pour, what will they say now? Will they cease such publications? Or will they go on as before, and repeat the same old song with ears deaf and necks hardened against all the facts in the case? There is another class of lexicons in the Greek we must notice. Budæus, 1519, H. Stephanus, 1572, Scapula, 1579, Passau, Hedoricus, Shrevelius, etc., being all abridgments directly from Stephanus, and he the same as Budæus. These all give 1. For classic meaning, sink and overwhelm. 2. They do not define it by dip, the very thing our opponents all want. 3. Not one of them gives any other New Testament meaning than abluo, lavo, cleanse, wash. They all being mere abridgments, Budæus and Stephanus alone deserve attention. They carefully separate the New Testament meaning from the classic meaning, while they carefully define it by words that cover our case, by a word that, while it means to wash, lavo, is also defined besprinkle by every Latin lexicon we ever saw. Yet they never give dip or immerse as a New Testament or Bible meaning at all. Hence, we have now over 30 authorities, from the standpoint of simple lexicography, with us and against our opponent. This is the more valuable when we remember that Budæus and Stephanus were reared and wrote their lexicons under the supreme reign of dipping, when dipping was the law and almost universal practice. See Conant, Baptizine, 138-9, law in England for dipping, as lately reinforced in 1662, and observed as such by J. Wesley, 1736, in the colony of Georgia, because a royal statute required it, and Wall, 2, 581. Note on Dr. Whitaker, 1624. It must be remembered that as late as 1470 there was not a man in France, England, or Germany that could read Greek, nor up till then had a grammar or lexicon of the Greek been published in either of those countries. Hence, a scientific or philological treatment of the subject could not be as yet expected. The sympathy of all the early lexicographers of France and England was with immersionists. Hence, quotations from Aquinas, Scotus, etc., 13th century, as well as many others we see in Booth and Baptist works, amount to nothing on such a question as this, their opinion being worth no more than it would be on astronomy, and for the same reason. But our opponents, so confident in lexicography, will not, dare not risk their cause with the lexicons. Far from it. President J. M. Pendleton of Pennsylvania, formerly of Tennessee, in Why I Am a Baptist, 86-96. Dr. A. Carson, 23-46, 55-6, Ingham, 43, A. Campbell, 114, 122, 127, Brents, 263-9, Conant and Gale and Fuller throughout, and Professor Ripley unite in the sentiment. Use is the sole arbiter of language. Lexicons do not constitute the ultimate authority. To the original Greek, therefore, and the fundamental laws of language, the science of word-building, of philology, we have to go. If you will turn your telescope to the philological heavens, now for the next day or so, you will see great auroras of Greek light blazing across the sky. The cannons of awful criticism will thunder in your ears, and Greek fire light up all your houses. In a word, now is the time to test the fundamental principles on which our opponents build their superstructure, test their value, and try all these so-called canons by which they propose to prove their propositions. If we are to appeal to language, we propose that it be in good faith that we do so appeal, and not to fry back from the consequences. The day has come when our claims here are to be tried on the merits of the case, by the strictest laws of language, by methods that are scientific, not superficial, empirical. Immersionists rely upon the following as settled principles and facts in philology. 1. That if baptizo or any word means to dip or immerse, it never can mean to sprinkle or to pour. Dr. Fuller, 1525. Carson, 52. Ingham, 104, 109, 184-9. A. Campbell, Christian Baptism, 147-9, Fraser, 70, Hinton, 44, Wilson, 184-5, etc., etc. 2. That wash is always a meaning of baptizo, from the idea of dipping, a result of it. I now appeal to Dr. Graves, and ask him, and all his learned associates here, is not the study of languages to proceed as any of the sciences, by first collecting all the facts possible, and then proceeding by inductive reasoning? He is bound to answer, yes. Have the authors, any of them, done this, or attempted it, as far as this word is concerned, after a scientific method? Can he name two lexicons that are not translations or abridgments, the one of the other, or both from one, that render this word alike? He cannot. In a third edition, 1831, he changes it again, erasing immerse and inserting sprinkle, just as he had erased lavo, wash, besprinkle from its place, and in the second edition inserted immerse. If science were underlying his superstructure, it could not totter thus. We now propose to prove the following facts. Take Schleusner's two lexicons, one for New Testament, the other for Septuagint Greek. His definitions of baptizo are wholly different, radically different. Take Wahl, a noted lexicographer as well as Schleusner of the present century. In two editions of the same year, 1829, his definitions are radically different as to order, and everything reversed. 1. That no lexicon gives immerse or dip as a meaning of baptizo in Greek earlier than BC 165. That is Polybius. Next, Diodorus Siculus, BC. 66 to 32. Next, Strabo, BC. 54 to AD. 54. Next, Josephus and Plutarch till AD 120. 2. That baptizo never means to dip. 3. That, though it means in later classic Greek to immerse, it is a derived, a late remote meaning, as well as a rare one. 4. That by all the laws of language, the science of language, sprinkle is the primary meaning of the word. 5. That all the facts, all dates, all the laws of all kindred or remoter languages completely sustain and demonstrate this fact. I am to show then, first, that no lexicon gives immerse or dip as a meaning in Greek earlier than Polybius. This only requires a dip into them, a glance. Wahl, the most favorable to immersion of all lexicons, gives Josephus first, Polybius next. He is the oldest, he quotes for it, or at all. Suasius. Polybius first and oldest that he quotes, so of Stephanus, Liddell, and Scott. Some lexicons begin with Plutarch, some with Diodorus Siculus, some with Josephus. A few with Polybius, not one goes higher up than to him for immerse. So Terretinus and Delingius begin with Plutarch. Not one ever quotes authority for a literal meaning of baptizo earlier than the same ones just given. This is far down in the decline, in the Iron Age of Greek. Is that science? Is that philology? This proves one thing at least. These lexicons were not discussing primaries, nor how meanings were derived. That field is all virgin soil yet, an unexplored sea, so far as baptizo is concerned. The Greek language had been spoken 1,400 years before Diodorus Siculus, and these authors flourished. It had been reduced to written forms nearly 1,000 years before these men flourished. What changes, what revolutions occurred during these centuries of change, of toil, of wars, of revolutions? And how absurd to seize a late, a remote, a rare meaning, as not only the primary one, but the only one. Second, we will now demonstrate that immerse is a rare and late meaning, and dip no meaning at all. And 1. The lexicons sufficiently attest that immerse is the latest of all the meanings of baptizo. 2. The texts they always cite demonstrate that dip is never a meaning of baptizo. Let Dr. Graves examine them and find one that means dip, a single citation given by any lexicon in classic Greek. 3. We propose to prove the entire proposition just made by the highest immersion authorities in the world that have lived or do live. A. Here, let it be remembered, they have all appealed their cause to the last and highest court, the originals in Greek, the classics themselves. B. Let it be carefully noted that this has been chosen as their best and main support, the Gibraltar of defense, the lair where they think to turn upon their pursuer with hope of successful resistance. C. We take their own rendering, when avowedly writing and translating to support their practices by the classics. D. Before we summon our witnesses, let us hear what these immersion luminaries wish to prove, for which, like giants, they hurl such fearful missiles. 1. Dr. Cox, Baptist, says, the idea of dipping is in every instance of bapto and baptizo conveyed. 2. Booth, the great standard of Baptists and disciples, baptizo is a specific term. So says constantly A. Campbell, ergo, page 148, the English expression dip is a specific term. 284. 3. Dr. Gale, learned Baptist, dipping only is baptism. 4. Roger Williams, professed founder in America of the Baptists, dipping is baptizing and baptizing is dipping. 5. Dr. A. Carson, my position is that it always signifies to dip. Page 55. 6. A. Campbell, disciple, all the learned admit that its baptizo primary, proper and unfigurative meaning is to dip. For all allow that dip is the primary and proper meaning of bapto. He asserts that baptizo inherits the proper meaning of bap, the root syllable, which is dip. Christian baptism, 120. This then is settled. Baptizo, according to Baptist authorities, and A. Campbell, always means to dip, nothing else. Dip is the action of their baptism. Let us now present their great lights in Europe and America, past and present, on this subject. Let me begin with Dr. J. M. Pendleton, bosom friend in the past with Dr. Graves. 1. Professor Pendleton, Why I Am a Baptist, from page 97 to 100, cites baptizo 22 times. Out of these 22 cases, he renders baptizo immerse twice, that is 20 against 2. He renders it dip only once, that is 21 against 1. Think of that. Once only does he find baptizo to his satisfaction, meaning to dip. 2. Dr. Gale, Baptist, result, 18 against 3 immerse, yea, and 18 against 3 to dip in classic usage. In Bible and Apocrypha, outside the ordinance, which is the point to be proved, he has 3 against 1 dip. 3. Dr. R. Fuller, Baptist, has it sink, 12 times, immerse, 3, dip 1, 21 against 1 dip 4. M. Stewart, Pedo-Baptist, summing up all the arguments for immersion, endorsed on that part by all the Baptists who now write, especially by Dr. Graves, who publishes it to aid their cause. Result, of 41 citations on baptizo, immerse 3 times, dip once, overwhelm 22 times, overflow once. Here, we have 38 cases, against 3 for immerse, 40 against 1 for dip. 5. Dr. A. Carson, the favorite Baptist, prince of their debaters in Europe or America, 31 citations. Of these, immerse 3 times, dip 3 times, i.e., 28 against 3 dip. Yet he said it always meant to dip. 6. Conant, head of Bible translators, prince of Baptist scholars in the East New York. Out of 63 consecutive cases, pages 43 to 82, immerse 10, whelm 45, overwhelm 8, that is, 53 against 10 for immerse, 63 against no dip. Does it always mean to dip? Of uncompounded occurrences, classic use, 141. Of these 141 cases, dip 7 times, that is, 134 against 7 for dip. It always means to dip, does it? 7. Ingham, Baptist, who had Conant, Carson, Gale and a Campbell, Booth, etc. before him. Of 169 occurrences of baptizo, he renders it overwhelm 50 times, dip once. That is 168 cases against 1 for dip. Does baptizo always signify to dip? 8. We must not pass A. Campbell here. He was a scar-worn veteran, an Ajax in this water war. In his maturest work, Christian Baptism, he cites baptizo 24 times. He renders it sink 10 times, overwhelm 10 times, overflow 1. But of the entire list he does not render it dip a single time. Bapto, the root. He renders dip constantly on the same pages, and his renderings, as a whole, are the most accurate, just and faithful we have ever seen from the immersion side. Let it sound through the land. Tell it everywhere, ye lovers of truth and fair dealing, that the prince of all American debaters, who carried war, they say, to the gates of Babylon. If he did not against the gates of Zion, rather, hero of Bethany, after wading through 1,000 years of Greek and elbow-deep in folios and musty alcoves, burdened with the lore of centuries. When asserting that dip is its primary, proper, and unfigurative meaning, returns today to light, to a thirsty, panting, anxious people, empty of results, not a case of dip in all the classic field. Enough on that point, it is made out. The sum of all these renderings is 457 against 18 for dip. These 18 cases are false renderings, as the rendering of Conant, Ingham, Stewart, and A. Campbell demonstrate. A careful examination of the case in Plutarch, the strongest in their estimation they have, will show it is not dip. In no instance on earth do the classics apply baptizo to any act that is the baptism of the Baptists. Not once do they. In no instance does it apply to the action of their baptism. Having demonstrated from immersion sources of such weight also, that first, baptizo does not mean to dip, second, that immerse is a rare meaning. We proceed now, third, to prove that it is a derived as well as a later meaning of baptizo. A. The assumption that bapto and baptizo are exactly the same in meaning, save that bapto applies to staining, dyeing, etc., and baptizo never, is utterly untrue, and the renderings of Carson, Stewart, A. Campbell, Conant, and Ingham show it. If they did not, an appeal to the texts at once demonstrates it. B. Carson, Ingham, Conant, etc., have demonstrated that the old rules relied on by Vossius, Beza, Suissa, Witzius, Teretius, Casaubon, etc., in defining baptizo and accounting for its meaning, is all a monstrous blunder. We leave it with them. In it, these old writers insist that it differs from dunai on the one hand for certain reasons, and from epipolizo on the other, etc. See Carson 65-6, Conant 88-89. C. A. Campbell, Judd, Conant, Carson, Ingham, President Pendleton, and Dr. J. R. Graves. All feel satisfied that the laws of philology, on which most of these men relied to prove that baptizo also came to mean sprinkle, pour, are all false and demolished. Indeed, as they feel that they have demolished the canons of the old school, we propose to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that their laws of language are equally unreliable, untrue. 1. The very fact that the lexicons assigned to no writer earlier than Polybius BC, 165 years, the meaning of immerse under the word, is proof, as far as lexicons go. But we readily grant, as all scholars will do, that they are not an ultimate authority at all. But second, as baptizo occurs centuries before Polybius, and in metaphorical senses as well as in a literal sense long before his day, it clearly points to an earlier meaning, which can easily be determined by the laws of language. Let us see some of the universally admitted meanings of baptizo in classic and Bible or scriptural Greek. Conant gives it 14 meanings. A. Campbell gives it in all his works full 20. Among its recognized meanings are intoxicate, wash, cleanse, whelm, overflow, overwhelm, and these are among its early meanings, long before it meant immerse. 3. By no law of language can you derive these meanings from immerse or dip as a primary. Take the definite and most decisive words for dip or immerse either in all Aryan and Semitic languages, and you, 1. Never find their meanings derived thence. 2. They cannot be so derived in the very nature of things, because so opposite in the great essential points of connection. Hence, the words for immerse and dip in Greek, enduo, buthidzo, pontidzo, kataduo, katapontidzo, dupto, never mean to wash, never mean to intoxicate, burden with taxes, never to whelm, overflow or overwhelm, never to wash. The Latin mergo, immergo, demergo, submergo, intingo is dip, the Hebrew taba, kafash, shaka, the Persic, guta, Ethiopic, mab, maba, Arabic, gata, gamara, quamasa, all mean to immerse. German, sinken, tauchen, undertauchen, eintauchen, immerse, dip. English, sink, dip. Where and when do they come to mean wash, overflow, whelm, overwhelm, or to asperse or abuse? The acknowledged meanings, then, of baptizo cannot be derived from dip or immerse. Hence, neither of these were primary meanings of the word. 4. Overflow is the meaning of baptizo in Aristotle, nearly 200 years before Polybius. Hence, as baptizo meant overflow quite 200 years before it meant immerse, it cannot be derived from immerse as a meaning. 5. It meant overwhelm in Plato, so rendered by all lexicons, by all Baptists, by A. Campbell, by all, so far as we have noticed, every time it occurs in Plato. Here we find baptizo meaning overwhelm, the element applied to the object, coming upon it, nearly 2 centuries and a half before we find it meaning to immerse. Hence, such a late child cannot be the parent of such a remote ancestor, nor can overwhelm be derived from immerse or dip. Doctors Gale, Cox, Morell, Mell admit that baptizo applies to cases where the water comes over it, baptized by superfusion. So A. Campbell, in the case of Elijah's altar, on which 12 pitchers, as the Hebrew reads, of water were poured. Origen, Bezel, and other Greeks calling it baptizing the altar, the wood, that it overwhelmed, as it were the altar. Here was baptism also by supervision from their own standpoint. See Gale, Reflect, on Wall, 276, Ingham 26, 27, 62. The abundant pouring of water on the altar, of which we have an account in 1 Kings 17:32-35, and which was done thrice, is spoken of by Origen as a baptism. 62. So speaks Mr. Ingham, Baptist. Now, aside from questions about specific action here, dip, etc., how can superfusion, overwhelming, clear and admitted cases of pouring, cases where the baptizing element comes over, comes upon, is poured upon the object, be derived from dip, from sink, etc., from immerse? When did a word that properly and primarily meant immerse come derivatively to have such a meaning? Never. Never. 7. But we now proceed to prove that words primarily meaning to sprinkle by common consent, and by all the facts, others that mean to moisten, where it is by a fusion of liquids, To wit, where it is by effusion, often of tears, dew, rain, juices of plants, vegetable matter, etc. Do come, derivatively, to mean all that baptizo means, all that is claimed for it or for bapto. This will, 1. Refute the boasted law on which immersionists feel willing to risk their case. Next, still later, in 1 Kings 22:38, it means to wash, applied to washing a chariot. We know the mode. Later, in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, frequently it occurs, meaning to overflow, overwhelm. Dan, she, 10. Also it means overflow, metaphorically. It still applies to such a pouring rain, Ezekiel 38:22, as overflows. Later still it comes to mean immerse, and is so defined by Buxtorf and all the authorities defining its later meaning. Its uses show it. Ingham, page 108-9, Hinton, 31, A. E. Campbell, 147-8, Carson, 52, Fuller, 1525. That if the word ever means immerse or dip or dye, Carson, it can never mean sprinkle or pour. 2. It will reconcile all difficulties, bring out the whole beauty of language, and give us a firm, immovable foundation on which to stand. Of a vast number of words that I have traced out, let us present a few from different branches of the two great families of languages in which the Bible and its versions and literature come down to us, Semitic and Aryan. We can only give a few of the many as samples. 1. Garaka, Arabic, primarily. It is to bedew, drop water, rain, dilute gently with tears, yet it comes to mean submerge, immerse, immersed in the sea, Castell. Schindler gives sweat, pour, fund it, yet repeats the definition immerse 20 times. 2. Chamitz, Hebrew Chaldee, to sprinkle with water. Schindler, sprinkle. Chamitz, Gesenius Thesaurus, sprinkle. Conspersa, yet it is to stain, dye, color, to dip, to immerse. Castell, intingere immergere. 3. Mathoth, Hebrew, sprinkle, immerse, immersion, Castell. 4. Shataf, Hebrew, primarily to trickle down, let fall, distill, to gush or pour forth. Gesenius, noun form, a pouring rain, an outpouring rain, raingust, first. Now note and trace this word. Primarily it is to trickle down, shed drops, let fall, distill. In Leviticus it comes to mean to wash, occurring 3 times, rendered kludzo in the Greek version. Next, still later, in 1 Kings 22:38, it means to wash, applied to washing a chariot. We know the mode. Later, in Jeremiah and Ezekiel frequently it occurs, meaning to overflow, overwhelm. Daniel 11:10, also it means overflow, metaphorically. It still applies to such a pouring rain, Ezekiel 38:22, as overflows. Later still it comes to mean immerse, and is so defined by Buxtorf and all the authorities defining its later meaning. Its uses show it. 5. The Chaldee word, savor. This word only occurs in Daniel, is a Chaldee Arabic and Syriac but not a Hebrew word. It is thus defined by Rabbi First, to moisten, to besprinkle, to baptize. It is translated by Jerome, sprinkle conspurgator. Its root meaning is to sprinkle, shed forth. In later Chaldee, Targum of Jonathan ben Uziel. It is often used for wash, rendered from kabas in Hebrew, wash. Later still, it came to apply to partial dips. Later still, it meant immerse also. 6. One more Semitic word, Hebrew and Arabic, balal, balala. The root meaning is by all the great standards. 1. Freytag, Arabic lexicon, to moisten, and especially to wet or macerate by sprinkling or gentle effusion of liquid. Asperso aut leviter affuso humor. Castell, moisten and specially wet or macerate by sprinkling. 3. Gesenius, to wet, moisten by effusion of liquid, falful, same root, sprinkle. Conspersit. 4. Lee, sprinkle, conspersit. 5. Schindler, pour, sprinkle. Yet this word comes ultimately to mean to dip in, so rendered by the lexicons in Tinxit Schindler, and is the Arabic translation of Luke 16:24, John 13:26 of bapto, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water when I have dipped it. To the same purpose we could quote Shabal, Natsach, Nakar, Tsuf, Shafa, Rathav, Lathar, etc., more or less, all covering leading meanings of bapto and baptizo, beginning with sprinkle or its equivalent. In the Greek the following will do: 1. Kluzo, passo, wash, bedash, wet. The glosses: sprinkle, aspergo, perfundo, Budaeus and Stephanus; periklusmati, sprinkling, aspergine, Groves; perikluzo, to wash all round or all over, dash water, sprinkle all over. Its primary force was to sprinkle or bedash with water where more or less force occurred. Klister is its noun, to that oftenest it is applied in earlier Greek. Yet in Aristotle even, it means to overflow when strengthened by a preposition, kata, and in late Greek Achilles, Tatius, etc., it applies to floods, inundations, overflowings commonly. Hence Stephanus, Shrevelius, etc., render it submerge, to be submerged. See now how the law operates. Primarily baptizo is to sprinkle. The same word constantly means in Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Arabic, both to sprinkle and to pour. From pouring of rain, of water or rain, comes wash as a meaning. The roots of herbs, dust, all soiling elements, are washed off from trees, vegetable matter, houses, fences, by pouring rains. From pouring rains we have overflow. That is a derived meaning of baptizo we see. From same we have overwhelm. From overwhelm we have, as the effect of being overwhelmed, sink, immerse. Thus the philology is perfect, and sprinkle demonstrated as the primary meaning of baptizo. By all the laws of philology in the world, by all the demonstrated science of language, if words are to be used in their primary sense, and only thus in the New Testament, we only are baptized, no Baptist is. Dr. Ditzler, time up.